So there's not a whole lot more that we have to do in Cinema because we've done a lot of the work up to this point as far as the lighting, texturing, and all that fun stuff. So we just need to go over our render settings one last time, render out this still image, and then do the next step, which instead of using After Effects to make a movie file, which is what we do in the other assignments, we're going to do a little bit of Photoshop instead to kind of retouch this photo. I guess you could look at it like that. So just to make it a little bit more presentable and add the last finishing touches to it. So that's what we will be covering today. So we're going to want to go into our render settings, and we are used to working with the width and height being 1280 by 720, but again we're doing a more vertical orientation render. So I actually have those two numbers flipped, and I need to make sure that this basically as a whole doubles in resolution, just so that way I know that I will have a nice good size still for my portfolio. And an easy way to do that is to click the lock ratio button, and then you can do ×2, and if you hit tab or enter in that numerical field, the program will do the math for you. That kind of goes without saying, or kind of throughout the whole program. Anytime you are in a text field, you can do relatively complex math. If you're familiar with like order of operations, like how to use your parentheses and stuff, you can do some pretty advanced math. But multiplying by 2 is fairly straightforward. On this one, again, this is a still image, so we are only going to render the first frame. In this case, just frame 0. No big deal. So let's set up our output so that way it will render in the right location. So in my assignment 3 folder, we're going to make a render folder. And a TIFF is fine. In my case, I am not using an alpha channel. It's possible that some of you, just depending on the way that you are setting up your product, you might want to use an alpha channel and put an image or a photograph in the background of your render, much like how we did on the last assignment. So use that ability at your discretion. We don't have to do anything in the anti-aliasing setting because, at least in my case, I have switched, and we did this a couple lessons ago, but I changed my render setting to the physical render, which means that the anti-aliasing is no longer in our control. But what is in our control is under this physical setting. And up to this point, I have been using the sample or sampler and sampling quality on these settings here, which is adaptive and automatic. And this just kind of lets the computer take care of most of the settings for us. With the shading error threshold value here at 20%, this is why when we render, we can see on some of these reflections there's a little bit of grain. It's called noise in rendering terms. This isn't exactly sort of clear, and the way that we want to clean that up, make that a little bit more pleasant looking, is by lowering this shading error threshold value. 20% is a good preview setting. If I'm working and I'm trying to work quickly, is that someone at the door? So yeah, this setting, if I'm working quickly, I'll probably raise it so that the render will go faster. But in this case, the trade-off for that is it makes it look worse. Again, this is the end of the process, and so we want to make sure our render looks nice and pretty. So I'm going to try a value of 3, anywhere between kind of 2 and 5 should be pretty good. So this is going to mean that this one frame will take a little bit longer than I'm used to, but it's not that bad because it only has to render the one frame, and once that one is done, then we're all good. So I should be ready to save and start up this render. So I'm just going to make sure that I save my file. I'm looking through the correct camera. I've got my lights enabled, all that good stuff. I know that I am ready to go. So I will click the Render to Picture Viewer button, and we will see that this will take a little while. So I'm going to pause the recording, and that will be that. So see you shortly. So we're back 31 minutes later, and my render is done. So it's looking pretty snazzy. If we zoom in and look at it full quality, it's nice and big, far larger than the small monitor resolution that I have to record with. So we can't see a whole lot of it, but it's all there, and it's looking super cool. So just to recap, during the break, I'd actually changed my render settings just a little bit. And what I did was I lowered my width and height ever so slightly, and my shading error threshold value I raised just a little bit as well, just to make sure that it could go a little bit faster. Even half an hour per frame is pretty slow, but it's done. So we'll move on to the next step, and that will be doing a little bit of, I guess you could call it, color grading. One aspect of color grading is kind of understanding the mood you're looking to kind of achieve. Color grading or color correction, kind of relatively similar terms. Their purpose is to enhance or shift kind of the meaning or the intention of the photograph. If you don't really understand what I'm saying, possibly a metaphor that might be familiar is like Instagram filters. You can alter the way that the photo will look by changing kind of the color, contrast, brightness, a little bit of blur, so on and so forth. Those are all tools in the color grading, I guess you could say, like suite, or common tools that you would use. So now that Photoshop is open, hopefully we can open up our render. And I want to examine my reference because, again, I want to kind of explain the mood or the intention behind why I'm going to do what I'm about to do. So in my reference, if we open these up, if you were to, I don't know, just come up with a word that might describe what this photo looks like, some words that might come to mind are like warm, or almost kind of like heavenly with like the rays of light. It is a very like positive and kind of inspiring way to show off this bottle. Obviously, there are a very wide variety of different products that people are rendering in here, so everyone's photograph reference will be different. It is up to you to determine the sort of mood or the words that could describe what you are looking to achieve. This image is a little bit different, although it is still a sort of a warm color palette with yellows and golds. It is a little bit more kind of like hardy. We see the made in New England, so that's kind of like blue collar, whatever. You can think as much or as little as you want to about kind of the psychology of what advertising or what the goal of advertising is, but that is all stuff that is important when we are trying to craft a photograph. This is stuff that you will learn as you, or if you take a photography class, kind of thinking of like, what is the moment you are trying to capture? And since we are trying to recreate a photograph with this assignment, we want to think the same way that a photographer does. So there are a few things that I immediately recognize that I want to do to my image, and that is kind of warm it up a little bit and kind of adjust kind of the bright and dark aspects of my image. And one of the ways that I like to do that is, cool, we have this pop-up that is perfectly in place of one of the buttons that I was looking to get to. There are a handful of tools in here, and one of them that I'm looking for is, no, not in there. If you're familiar with Photoshop, hopefully you will kind of be used to using maybe the levels or exposure, settings, hue and saturation, etc. There is one sort of master kind of control that I like to use, and it is called the camera raw filter. But first, before we use it, I am going to convert my layer to a smart object, and that is so that I can edit this setting later, and we can find camera raw filter under the filter menu. So this menu, the reason I like to use this is because its interface is very similar to the program Lightroom. Lightroom is kind of the digital equivalent of how you could develop a photo. It is also a very good tool if you are sifting through all of the photographs that you just took on a shoot, for example. And so kind of right off the bat, one of the first things that I can do is kind of adjust this color temperature slider a little bit towards the sort of warm side to the yellow, and I can start to bring some of that sort of yellowish gold feeling more into my render. I can also sort of adjust the highlights and contrast, and one thing that I want to do is try to make sure that these bright sections on my bottle pop a little bit more, just so that they get a little bit more attention, a little bit more focus, and I can sort of zoom in a little bit, just because this is playing, or it's showing up at only 1/3 size, just because of where I landed as far as the resolution goes. So most of these sliders are relatively self-explanatory. If we, take the blacks slider, that is referring to the darker portions of the image. If we go the other way, we'll see that the darker portions of the bottle and the background, for example, these now get brighter. Kind of the inverse is true if we want to edit the white pixels in the image. So pretty self-explanatory what each one of these does. I would encourage you to kind of explore through all of these different tools. There's also tools for sharpening, and one thing that I really like to use when I'm working with these is shifting specific ranges of color. Now in my case, I have a relatively uniform color palette in my render. But if, for example, you had, let's say you had two objects, one was red and one was green, you would be able to kind of control or shift the color temperature of one of those. Say, for example, if you wanted to make the red a little bit more of like a magenta or like a pinkish red, as opposed to like a orange, like an orangish red, you would be able to slide the red slider here, and we can see on the left hand side of it, you can shift that to the magenta range. So that's not very relevant in my case, because I'm dealing with mostly the yellows and the oranges. So we can see if I shift this oranges slider, I can turn this into like almost a kind of eerie sort of green. It's almost kind of like Matrix, sort of the yellowish green. If I go in one direction, if I go the other direction, it starts to turn this kind of weirdish red. which is also kind of equally unsettling. And so I don't think I'm going to use a whole lot of what is available in this menu, but if you have more color present in yours, I would definitely recommend trying it out. Another thing that is pretty useful, and this is very common if we look up orange cyan. There is kind of a running joke, well, I guess you could say kind of in the film industry, and that is the sort of cinematic tendency to grade things with cool, dark colors and warm, bright colors. This is most commonly described as like the orange and cyan or orange and teal look. If you were to examine a host of movie posters, this is a very, very common, almost too common sort of look. And the reason that it is so common is it is rooted in some sort of use or like a natural sort of look. This sort of color grading makes certain skin tones warmer and a little bit more appealing, and it makes darker tones a little bit more, I guess, kind of like outdoorsy looking. There is a lot of blue overcast in most outdoor footage because typically the sky is kind of blue, and it brings in a lot of blue colored light. So that is common and kind of overused as it is. I like to actually do sort of employ it. And so what we want to do here is in our highlights, if we were to try to see what this looks like, we would want to bring the hue slider for the highlights kind of to the orangish red range, bring up the saturation slider a little bit, and then down here in the shadows, we slide the shadows saturation to a sort of similar value. I like to kind of keep the two saturation values pretty tied together. And then this balance here, we can kind of shift from one color to another, and is kind of overdone and overused as that effect is. I think it's relatively pleasant. I can refer back to what my original image looked like by mousing over this setting here. It is the second in the bottom right, or the letter P on your keyboard. So this is my original, and this is where it is. It's kind of a little bit more contrast. There's a little bit more color information, which is kind of giving a little bit more sort of visual appeal. Although I do think it's a little bit heavy kind of on the cool. So I'm going to dial that back a little bit. And there are a handful of other sliders to use. The last one that I don't want to neglect is vignetting. And what vignetting is it is the easiest thing is to just show too much of it. And vignetting is the darkening of the corners of an image. And the reason for this is if you make an image darker or harder to see, it kind of draws your eye away from that. And by putting that effect sort of on the outside corners of the image, its attempt is to draw your eye inwards to the middle of the frame. Obviously this is way too much strength for the effect, so I'm going to dial that back to a kind of more reasonable amount. And if I wanted to, I could play with some of these other settings. Cool. So yeah, I think that is about it for the camera raw setting. I really like it because it encompasses a lot of common tools. So one thing that I do, or another thing that I want to do while I'm in here, is I want to crop this a little bit. I recognize that there's kind of a little bit too much empty space up here. It's just kind of unfortunate. I could have caught this and rotated my background image a little bit more, but this big sort of empty blob of nothing in this background is rather unappealing. It's not adding anything to my image, so I might as well remove it, I say. So I'm going to bring the crop tool just by hitting C on the keyboard. Bring the top of this canvas down a little bit just to mitigate how much dead space there is above the bottle. And just to keep this short, I'm going to do one last thing, and that is it's called lifting the blacks, or fading. It is like a very common thing in Instagram filters, because what you can do is you can make some of the darker portions of your render not quite as harsh. So to do that, we want to get a value, a color value that isn't purely black, some sort of deep gray, and we can make a new layer and fill this new layer with our desired color by hitting Alt and Delete on our keyboard. So this will, as of right now, currently or completely block the image. So we want to change to a blending mode, and I believe multiply should get the job done. So what we want to do is just to use a very small amount of this, and actually multiply might not be the right. I'll know it when I see it. Yeah, here we go. So the blending mode that I'm settling with is called Lighten Color. And this is kind of you know, the prototypical Instagram filter sort of look, where the darker portions of the image aren't quite as dark, and I recognize now on the projector you can basically see none of this because of the projector's quality. So hopefully this will come through in the recording. Just name that layer Fade. And so if I just duplicate this layer just as an example, this is the original. So if I turn this layer on and off, we can kind of see our before and after. And I would welcome you to explore some of this. If you have a specific reference image in mind, definitely feel free to ask me sort of what kind of description or what techniques are being used in it if you would like to recreate something, and I can help you out. But I'm pretty happy with this, so I'm just gonna real quick save out my PSD, just so that way I can always edit this again in the future, or if I lose it or whatever. And then I will save the file that I'm going to turn in now. So now that we're done, I will save out a JPEG, and we can click Save. Maximum quality is fine. And then that's it. I will have a JPEG in my render folder, and this is what I will be turning in. So call that job done, and see you in the next one.